In the very last row of the classroom, tucked into a corner where the shadows from the afternoon sun stretched long and lazy, sat a girl who was an expert at disappearing. She wasn't magical, and she didn't have a cloak of invisibility. Her method was much simpler and much more effective. She was just quiet. So quiet, in fact, that most days the other students and even some of the teachers would forget she was there. Her name was Maya, but to the bustling world of Northwood High, she was just an empty chair in the front that had somehow migrated to the back. Every day was the same ritual. She would slip into the room just before the final bell, her hood pulled up over her head, a shield against the world. She would navigate the maze of desks and backpacks without a word, her eyes fixed on the worn linoleum floor. Her destination was always the same, the corner seat. It was her fortress. From there, she could watch the entire room without being a part of it, a ghost in a faded gray hoodie. She would pull the sleeves down over her hands, tuck her chin to her chest, and become part of the furniture. Her grades were a perfect reflection of her presence. Not good enough to be praised, not bad enough to be noticed. They were just, there. A steady, quiet average that screamed, "Don't look at me." This particular afternoon was for music appreciation, a class most students treated like a free period. It was taught by Mr. Anwar, a man who seemed to be powered by a different kind of energy than everyone else. While his students slumped in their seats, scrolling through their phones or doodling in notebooks, Mr. Anwar paced the front of the room like a conductor on a grand stage. He was a man who had once played piano in grand concert halls, a fact he mentioned not with arrogance but with a kind of wounded wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe he'd ended up here, trying to convince a room full of teenagers that a melody by Chopin was more exciting than the latest viral video. He believed music wasn't just sound. It was a language, a story, a piece of someone's soul laid bare. And he was desperate for his students to learn how to listen. Maya, of course, seemed to be his greatest challenge. To him, she wasn't just a shy girl. She was a puzzle, an enigma wrapped in silence. While other kids were at least visibly bored or annoyed, she was a blank slate. Her face, when he could see it under the shadow of her hood, was unreadable. She just stared out the window, her gaze distant, as if the music was just wind whistling through the trees. But Mr. Anwar had learned to look closer. He had noticed things, little things. When he played a piece with a complex, driving rhythm, he'd seen her fingers, resting innocently in her lap, begin to move. They weren't just tapping. They were playing. They would press down on her thigh in intricate patterns, mimicking the chords and runs on the piano with an accuracy that was startling. It was a secret performance, hidden in plain sight. Today he decided to test his theory. He told the class he was going to play a piece that was technically very difficult, a study in passion and precision. He dimmed the lights slightly, a trick he used to make them focus, and pressed play on the sound system. The room filled with the furious, beautiful storm of a Rachmaninoff prelude. The notes cascaded and tumbled over one another, a waterfall of sound that filled every corner of the quiet room. A few kids shifted in their seats. One girl put her head down on her desk, but most just stared blankly ahead. Mr. Anwar, however, wasn't watching them. His eyes were fixed on the back corner. And there it was. Maya's hands, which had been hidden inside her sleeves, slowly emerged. As the music grew more intense, her right hand began to move, her fingers dancing an invisible dance on her jeans. They flew and leaped, perfectly in sync with the frantic melody pouring from the speakers. Then her left hand joined in, playing the deep, resonant chords that gave the piece its foundation. Her eyes were still on the window, but her face had changed. The blankness was gone, replaced by a deep, aching concentration. For a fleeting moment, she wasn't a shy girl in a hoodie. She was a musician, completely lost in the music. She was feeling every note, a story of joy and sorrow playing out across her features. To Maya, the music was a key that unlocked a door she kept tightly bolted. It didn't just enter her ears. It flooded her entire being, pulling her back to a time when her world wasn't silent. She could almost smell the lemon polish her mother used on the old upright piano in their living room. She could feel the smooth, cool ivory keys under her own small fingers. She remembered her mother's hands, slender and graceful, guiding hers, whispering, "Feel it, don't just play it. Let the music tell you its secrets." The memory was so vivid, so real, that her body responded on its own, her fingers remembering the patterns her mother had taught her long ago. But with the beautiful memory came a wave of pain so sharp it felt like a physical blow. The music was a reminder of everything she had lost, everything she had promised to keep locked away. A single hot tear pricked a corner of her eye, and she quickly blinked it away, stuffing her hands back into her sleeves as if they had been burned. The final, thundering chord of the prelude echoed through the room and then faded into silence. The spell was broken. The girl in the corner was gone, replaced once more by the ghost. Mr. Anwar watched as she seemed to shrink, her shoulders curling inward, her chin dropping to her chest. She had felt his gaze on her, he was sure of it. The bell shrieked, signaling the end of the day. The classroom erupted in the sudden chaos of shuffling papers, zipping backpacks, and loud chatter. Maya was the first one out of her seat. She moved with a new urgency, not her usual slow, silent drift, but a quick, almost panicked escape. She kept her head down, her hood pulled low, and navigated through the crowd of her classmates without a single touch, as if she were water flowing around stones. She was out the door and gone before Mr. Anwar could even think of saying a word. He stood alone in the now empty classroom, the faint scent of chalk dust and teenage perfume hanging in the air. He looked at the empty corner desk, a small smile touching his lips. He had been right. It wasn't disinterest he had seen in her all those weeks. It was something much, much deeper. It was a fire bank so low it was almost invisible, but a fire nonetheless. And he, Mr. Anwar, was a man who could not resist a flame. He saw not a shy student who needed to be left alone, but a locked door with the most beautiful music coming from behind it. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had to find a way to open it. The silence that followed the bell was a heavy blanket, but Mr. Anwar didn't mind it. He stood by the window, watching the students pour out of the school doors and scatter across the lawns like spilt seeds. His mind, however, was still in the back corner of his classroom, replaying the silent concert he had just witnessed. The image of Maya's fingers flying across the fabric of her jeans was burned into his memory. It wasn't just a student tapping along to a beat. It was a conversation. She had been speaking the language of music fluently, beautifully, and she didn't want anyone else to hear. He felt a knot of conflict tighten in his stomach. Was it his place to pull her into the light? Or was he being selfish, wanting to uncover a treasure for his own satisfaction? He thought of his own youth, the teachers who had pushed him, the ones who had seen a flicker of potential and fanned it into a fire, sometimes against his will. They had been right to do it. He made a decision. He wouldn't let that fire go out. The next day his campaign began. It started with a question. As the class settled, he brought up the Rachmaninoff piece again. "So what did we think?" he asked, his eyes scanning the room. "What story was the music telling us?" A few mumbled answers came back. "It was fast. Sounded kinda angry." Mr. Anwar nodded, then let his gaze rest on the back corner. "Maya, what did you feel when you heard it?" Every head in the room turned to look at her. It was like a spotlight had been switched on, illuminating her in the harsh glare of everyone's attention. Maya flinched, her shoulders rising up towards her ears as if to protect her neck. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, and a hot, prickly sensation crawled up her spine. She stared down at her desk, at a small carving in the wood that looked like a sad face. She shook her head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. I don't know," she mumbled, her voice so quiet it was barely a whisper. Mr. Anwar didn't push further that day. He just nodded and moved on, but he had made his point. The day after that, as the class was working on a quiet assignment, he walked the aisles, stopping briefly at each student's desk. When he got to Maya's, he placed a single piece of paper on top of her textbook. It was sheet music. The title was Clair de Lune, a piece he knew was beautiful but not overly complex. He didn't say a word, just laid it down and kept walking. Maya stared at the paper as if it were a spider. The black notes dotted across the 5 lines seemed to pulse with a life of their own. She recognized the piece. Her mother had loved it. Her fingers, hidden once again in her sleeves, twitched with a memory of how it felt to play those first gentle chords. For a split second, a wave of longing washed over her, a powerful urge to go home, lift the dusty sheet, and let the music flow. But the feeling was quickly chased away by a cold, gripping fear. She thought of her mother's pale face, her weak voice making her promise. "It's our secret, my sweet girl. Just for us." With a shaky hand, she slid the paper off her book, folded it into a small, tight square, and stuffed it deep into her pocket. Where it burned against her thigh all day, this became their quiet. Unspoken war, Mr. Anwar would leave a new piece of music every few days, a batch invention, a simple chop and waltz. And Maya would, without fail, tuck each one away, a growing collection of forbidden treasures in her backpack. At night, alone in her quiet apartment, she would sometimes pull them out. She would smooth the creased paper on her bed, her eyes tracing the notes she knew so well. She could almost hear them in her head, a beautiful, tantalizing ghost of a sound. But she never went near the piano. The sheet covering it remained undisturbed. A white shroud over her past. Mr. Anwar could see his subtle approach was failing. Maya was retreating further into her shell, if that was even possible. She seemed to be bracing for impact every time she walked into his class. He knew he had to do something more drastic, something that would leave her no room to hide. It was a risk, a huge one, but he felt the weight of responsibility for a gift that was being wasted. So, one Monday, he made an announcement that changed everything. "All right, everyone, settle down," he said, his voice cutting through the usual end-of-day chatter. "We're going to end this semester with a final project. And it's a simple one." He paused, letting the suspense build. "Each of you will prepare and perform a solo piece, 2 minutes long, for the class. It can be on any instrument you play, or you can sing. This will be a major part of your grade." A collective groan rippled through the classroom. "Oh, come on, Mr. Anwar!" One boy yelled. "I don't play anything." Another student chimed in, "Can't we just write a report?" Mr. Anwar shook his head, a firm smile on his face. "Nope, the point of this class is to appreciate music by experiencing it. And there's no better way to experience it than by creating it yourselves. You have 3 weeks. I'll help you find something simple if you need it. But everyone performs." While the other students complained and panicked, Maya sat in frozen silence. It felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild drumbeat. A solo performance. In front of everyone. The words echoed in her head, each one a nail being hammered into a coffin. She felt a wave of dizziness and gripped the sides of her desk to keep from sliding out of her chair. This wasn't a gentle nudge anymore. This was a shove off a cliff. When the bell rang, Maya tried to make her usual quick escape, but a familiar voice stopped her. "Maya, can I see you for a moment?" She turned to see Mr. Anwar standing by his desk. She walked towards him slowly, her feet feeling like they were made of lead. The last few students filtered out of the room, leaving them alone in the echoing quiet. "Maya," he began, his voice softer than it had been during his announcement. "I know this is scary for you." He looked at her, his eyes full of a sincerity that was almost more unnerving than his sternness. "But I also know you can do this. I've seen it. I've seen the music in you, and it's too beautiful to keep hidden. Don't waste this. Don't waste what you have." There was no anger in his voice, only a deep, unwavering belief that felt heavier than any command. Maya couldn't speak. She just stood there, her throat tight, and gave a tiny, jerky nod before turning and fleeing the room. She walked home in a daze, the noisy world around her muffled by the roaring in her own ears. She unlocked the door to her small, silent apartment and dropped her backpack on the floor. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the living room, and in the corner, the upright piano stood like a sleeping beast under its white sheet. She walked over to it, her feet moving as if in a dream. She reached out a trembling hand and lifted a corner of the sheet. The dust tickled her nose, and she could see the yellowed ivory keys underneath, stained with the memories of 1,000 happy afternoons. A single tear escaped and rolled down her cheek, dropping onto her hand. She was trapped. The teacher's words, the promise to her mother, the music in her soul, it was all a tangled knot, and she didn't know how to undo it without breaking something precious, maybe even herself. The 3 weeks that followed were a slow, agonizing crawl for Maya. Each day felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of dread. The announcement of the solo performance project had cast a permanent shadow over her, a dark cloud that followed her from the classroom to her small, silent apartment. She did not go near the piano. The white sheet remained a stark, unmoving monument to her promise. Instead, she lived in a state of quiet paralysis. She would sit on her bed in the evenings, her homework untouched, and just stare at the corner of the room where the piano stood. It was no longer a beloved instrument. It was a monster sleeping under a sheet, and she was terrified that if she touched it, it would wake up and devour her dot in class. She became even more of a ghost. She perfected the art of being invisible, shrinking into her hoodie, her breath held tight in her chest whenever Mr. Anwar's gaze swept the room. He didn't push her anymore. He didn't leave sheet music on her desk. He just watched her with a look that was a confusing mix of expectation and, she thought, a little bit of pity. This was almost worse than the direct pressure. The silence between them was charged with unspoken words, a countdown to a moment she was desperate to avoid. The other students buzzed about their projects, complaining about having to practice the guitar or worrying about forgetting the lyrics to a song. Maya just listened, her secret a heavy stone in her stomach. They were nervous. She was facing the end of her world. Finally, the day of the performances arrived. The atmosphere in the classroom was thick with a strange energy. A mix of teenage angst and forced excitement. Mr. Anwar had rolled the school's electric keyboard to the front of the room, its black sleekness a stark contrast to the dusty wooden upright in Maya's living room. As students filed in, they eyed it with a mixture of fear and resignation. Maya took her usual seat in the corner, her hands clammy inside her sleeves. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a movie of someone else's life. This couldn't really be happening to her. The performances began. A boy with a spiky haircut fumbled his way through a simple rock song on an acoustic guitar, his face red with embarrassment. A girl with a bright pink backpack sang a pop song, her voice shaky and off-key. A few others read poems they claimed were lyrics. The class was polite, offering a smattering of applause after each turn, but most kids were just glad it wasn't them. With each performance that passed, the knot in Maya's stomach tightened. It was like watching the number on a countdown clock get closer and closer to 0. Then, Mr. Anwar looked down at his clipboard and his eyes found hers. The room felt suddenly colder. "Maya," he said, his voice calm but clear, cutting through the low hum of classroom chatter. "You're up?" It was as if all the air had been vacuumed out of the room. Every head turned. Maya felt her body freeze, her muscles locking in place. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She just shook her head, a small, frantic motion from side to side. I can't," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Mr. Anwar didn't look angry. He looked at her with a steady, unwavering gaze. "Yes, you can," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He wasn't asking. He was telling. He gestured toward the keyboard at the front of the room. "Now, please." A wave of heat washed over her, followed by a chilling cold. This was it. The forcing. There was no escape. The eyes of the entire class were on her, a wall of silent judgment. She could feel their curiosity, their impatience. With legs that felt like they were made of wood, she pushed her chair back and stood up. The walk to the front of the room was the longest journey of her life. Each step was a monumental effort. The floorboards creaked under her feet, sounding like thunder in the dead silence. She could feel 100 pairs of eyes boring into her back. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the keyboard as if it were the edge of a cliff. She sat on the hard plastic bench. The black and white keys stared up at her, cold and unforgiving. For a long moment she just sat there, her hands hovering above them, trembling. Her mind was a blank wall of terror. She couldn't remember a single note. She couldn't remember why she was even there. All she could think about was her mother's voice, so weak and frail in the hospital bed, making her promise. Our secret, Maya, just for us. Playing for this room full of strangers felt like the ultimate betrayal, but then she looked up and saw Mr. Anwar. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't nodding in encouragement. He was just watching, his expression unreadable. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. Maybe it was defiance. Maybe it was just a desire to get this horrible moment over with. She took a deep, shuddering breath and let her fingers fall onto the keys. The first note that rang out was hesitant, like a question asked in a dark room. It was a single, clear sound that hung in the air, and every head in the class tilted slightly. Then another note followed, and another. Slowly, a melody began to form. It was not a song anyone recognized. It was something she had created, a piece of her own soul laid bare. The music started softly, a simple, childlike tune that spoke of sunlight streaming through a window and the smell of lemon polish. It was the sound of her mother's laughter, the feeling of small hands being guided over the ivory keys. The melody grew stronger, more confident, painting a picture of a happy living room filled with warmth and love. This was the secret part, the treasure she had kept locked away. The class was completely still. The boy who had been fidgeting with his phone had put it down, his mouth slightly agape. The girl who had been whispering to her friend was now leaning forward, her eyes wide. The room was utterly captivated. Then the music changed. A single, discordant note broke the beautiful melody, like a crack in a perfect piece of glass. The tempo became frantic, the notes tumbling over each other in a rush of panic and fear. The sound of a hospital monitor, the hushed whispers of doctors in the hallway, the feeling of a small hand getting colder. The music was a story of heartbreak, a desperate plea that went unanswered. The frantic pace slowed, sinking into a deep, mournful melody that was so full of pain it was almost unbearable to hear. It was the sound of a promise made at a bedside, a promise to seal away this beautiful thing to honor a loss. The final notes were soft, fading away one by one, like a heartbeat slowing down until there was nothing left but a single, lingering tone that hung in the air for what felt like an eternity before it, too, disappeared into silence. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was not empty. It was full. It was heavy with awe, with confusion, with a shared, unspoken grief. Maya sat frozen, her fingers still resting on the keys. A single tear escaped from the corner of her eye and fell onto the plastic, a tiny, perfect bead of water reflecting the light. She had not just played a song. She had told them everything. Her secret was no longer hers. It belonged to the room now. The silence that followed the last fading note was a living thing. It filled the classroom, pressing in on the walls and the desks, thick with a story that had no words. For a long moment, no one moved. The boy who had been slouching in his seat was now sitting up straight, his phone forgotten on his desk. The girl who had been whispering to her friend had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a dawning understanding. They hadn't just heard a song. They had felt a memory. They had walked through a stranger's sorrow and come out the other side changed. The ghost in the corner had just become the realest person in the room. Then, from the front row, a single sound broke the spell. It was the slow, deliberate clap of a girl who was known more for her sarcastic comments than her kindness. It wasn't a polite, obligatory applause. It was a clap of recognition, of respect. It was followed by another, then another, until the entire classroom was on their feet, the sound growing into a thunderous, heartfelt ovation that shook the very foundations of the quiet room. It was a wave of sound, not for a perfect performance, but for a brave one. Maya sat frozen at the keyboard, her fingers still resting on the keys that had just betrayed her deepest secret. The sound washed over her, but it didn't feel real. Her heart was a frantic bird against her ribs, and a hot flush of shame and a cold wave of relief were fighting a war inside her. She had done it. She had broken her promise. And now they were clapping. She didn't know how to feel. She just knew she had to get out of there. She snatched her hands back as if the keys were on fire and stood up so quickly she almost knocked the bench over. Without looking at anyone, she fled back to her desk, grabbed her backpack, and kept her head down, her hair falling like a curtain to hide her face. The bell shrieked, a piercing, welcome sound that shattered the moment. The classroom erupted in its usual chaos, but this time it was different. The energy was softer, more considerate. As Maya made her way to the door, the sea of students seemed to part for her. No one jostled her. No one shouted. A boy she had never spoken to moved his backpack out of her way, giving her a small, almost shy nod of respect. She felt their eyes on her, but it wasn't the curious, pitying stare she was used to. It was something else, something she couldn't name. She just wanted to escape. Maya, wait a moment. The voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise. It was Mr. Anwar. She stopped, her hand on the doorknob, her back to him. She could feel the last few students glance at them as they left, and then the door clicked shut, leaving them alone in the echoing room. She didn't turn around. She couldn't. She heard his footsteps approach, slow and hesitant. He stopped a few feet behind her. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. The silence was back, but this time it was just between the two of them. It was heavy with all the things that had just happened. Maya, he said again, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. I am so sorry. The words were so unexpected that they made her flinch. She had been ready for a lecture, for I told you so, for a discussion about her grade, but not an apology. Slowly she turned around. Mr. Anwar looked genuinely humbled. The usual confident energy that seemed to power him was gone, and his shoulders were slumped slightly. He looked older, tired. I pushed you because I saw a spark of genius in you, he continued, his eyes meeting hers with a direct, honest gaze. I saw a talent that was too rare and too beautiful to be hidden away. But I had no idea. I was asking you to break a promise. I was so focused on the music that I didn't think about the person. I was wrong to force you like that. Maya just stared at him, her throat tight. She hadn't realized she was crying until she felt a tear track down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away with the sleeve of her hoodie. I made a promise to my mom, she whispered, her voice cracking. The words came out before she could stop them, but once they started, they kept flowing. Before she got really sick. We used to play together. She was a musician too. She said our music was our secret treasure just for the two of us. So I promised I would only ever play for her. As she spoke, the weight of the secret she had carried for so long finally began to lift, replaced by the sharp, fresh pain of the memory. But there was something else too. A tiny bit of relief. Mr. Anwar listened intently, his expression full of a deep, aching empathy. He didn't interrupt. He just let her talk, let the story pour out of her. When she finished, he nodded slowly. A promise like that is sacred, he said, his voice gentle. I understand why you kept it. But Maya, listen to me. He took a small step closer. A gift like yours, it doesn't belong to you. Not really. It's something that flows through you. Sharing your music doesn't break your promise to her. It honors the gift she gave you. It lets her spirit live on, not just in your memory, but in the hearts of everyone who hears it. You can still play for her, but maybe you can let the rest of us listen in. He looked at the keyboard, then back at her. What you played today, that wasn't just a performance. That was a tribute. And it was one of the most beautiful things I have ever heard. Maya didn't know what to say. His words were like a key, unlocking a part of her heart that she had kept padlocked shut for 2 years. The idea that sharing her music could be an honor, not a betrayal, was a revolutionary thought. It was a seed being planted in the barren soil of her grief. Thank you, she finally managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. It was the most she had ever said to him at one time. He gave her a small, sad smile. You should get home. She nodded, turned, and walked out of the classroom. The hallway was empty, and the school was quiet. As she walked home, the world seemed to look different. The colors of the sunset seemed brighter, the air felt crisper. The heavy, invisible cloak she had worn for so long felt a little bit lighter. The secret was out, but the world hadn't ended. Instead, it had opened up, just a little. When she got back to her apartment, she looked at the piano in the corner. The white sheet didn't look like a shroud anymore. It looked like a veil waiting to be lifted. She didn't play it, not yet. But for the first time in a long time, she thought that maybe one day she could. The weeks that followed were like the first thaw after a long, hard winter. The world outside the classroom windows began to change, the green leaves of autumn turning to brilliant shades of gold and crimson before finally letting go and drifting to the ground. Inside Maya, a similar change was taking place. The heavy, frozen grief that had settled in her heart was beginning to soften, its sharp edges melting away. The secret was no longer a stone weighing her down. It had become a story, and telling it had set her free. The first thing she did when she got home that day, after the apology and the kind words from her teacher, was walk over to the piano. She didn't hesitate. She reached out and pulled the white sheet off in one smooth, decisive motion. It floated to the floor like a ghost, and there it was, the old upright piano, no longer a monster or a monument, but just a piano. Its wood was scuffed and worn, the ivory keys yellowed with age, but to Maya it was the most beautiful thing in the world. She sat on the bench, her fingers hovering over the keys, just as they had in the classroom. But this time there was no fear. There was only a deep, aching sense of coming home. She began to play. It was the same melody she had shared with her class, the story of her and her mother. But this time it was different. Playing it alone in the quiet of her apartment, with the last rays of the sun streaming through the window, the music wasn't a confession born of pressure. It was a tribute. It was a conversation with a memory. The sad parts were still sad, a gentle ache for what she had lost, but they were no longer suffocating. They were wrapped in a warm, golden layer of love and gratitude. When she finished, she didn't feel drained or exposed. She felt peaceful. For the first time in 2 years, the music felt like a gift again, not a burden. Life at school began to change too. The invisible girl had become visible. In the hallways, students who had never looked at her before would now offer a small smile or a nod of recognition. The girl who had started the applause and claps sometimes saved a seat for her. It wasn't that they were suddenly all best friends. It was a quiet, unspoken respect. They had seen a piece of her soul, and they had treated it with care. Maya found herself walking a little taller, her hood no longer a permanent fixture. She even started raising her hand in her other classes, not every time, but when she knew an answer. Her voice was still quiet, but it was steady. Mr. Anwar had changed too. He never again put her on the spot or pressured her to share. Instead, he became a quiet supporter. He would sometimes catch her eye after class and give her a simple, knowing smile as if they were sharing a secret. One day, as the semester was drawing to a close, he put up a flyer for the annual Winter Arts Showcase. It was a school-wide event, a big deal with a real stage in the auditorium and a large audience of parents and students. After class, he approached her desk. "The showcase is coming up," he said, his voice casual. "There's always a spot for a talented pianist if you're interested." He didn't push. He didn't tell her she should do it. He just laid the possibility out there like a sheet of music and left it for her to decide what to do with it. The idea was terrifying. A classroom was one thing, but the auditorium stage? That was a different world. But as she walked home that day, the idea didn't leave her. She thought about what Mr. Anwar had said about honoring her mother's gift. She thought about the feeling of playing the piano again, the joy of it. And she thought about the new melody that had been swirling around in her head, a tune that was different from the sad one. This one was hopeful, full of light and air. That night, for the first time, she didn't just play old songs. She started to write. She sat at the piano for hours, letting the new music flow through her fingers. It was a song about resilience, about finding strength in sorrow, about a promise changing from a lock into a key. She decided she would do it. She would perform at the showcase. The night of the performance, the school auditorium was buzzing with energy. Parents chatted in the seats, and students fidgeted nervously backstage. Maya was not in a hoodie. She wore a simple, dark blue dress that her mother had once loved. It felt strange and wonderful to be so exposed, but she didn't feel shy. She felt ready. When her name was announced, a quiet hush fell over the crowd. She walked onto the stage, not with her head down, but with her chin up. The bright lights were warm, not harsh. She looked out at the sea of faces and wasn't afraid. She found Mr. Anwar in the front row. He wasn't looking at her with expectation, but with a calm, proud smile. He gave her a small, encouraging nod. Maya sat at the grand piano, its polished black surface gleaming under the lights. She took a deep breath, placed her fingers on the keys, and began to play. The music that filled the auditorium was not the sad story from the classroom. It was the new song, the one she had written. It started out soft and tentative, like a seed sprouting through the cold earth. It grew stronger, more complex, weaving together melodies of remembrance and hope. There were moments of shadow, notes that echoed the sadness she would always carry, but they were always followed by bursts of light, triumphant chords that soared towards the ceiling. It was the sound of a girl who had been lost in the dark but had found her own way back to the light. It was the sound of courage. When she played the final note, it hung in the air, clear and pure. For a second there was silence. Then the auditorium erupted. The applause was louder than anything she had ever heard. A wave of sound that was not just for a performance, but for a journey. Maya stood up and bowed, a real, proper bow. She looked out at the standing, cheering crowd, and she saw not just faces, but hearts that her music had touched. She was no longer the shy student in the back of the room. She was Maya the musician. And her voice finally was being heard.